Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to show you how to do this little sample that I've done. I want to show you how to do this pretty little pattern. Now you're going to be working in chain spaces. Instead of the top of your stitches, you're going to be in between the stitches in the chain spaces, and you're going to be working in between the V stitches of this little pattern. It is a 4-row repeat, but it's really simple. You do 3 rows of the mesh. It's really quick to do that. It's just 1 stitch, a chain, 1 stitch, a chain. Your second row is your V stitches, and you're going to be working into the chain spaces of your mesh for this. It's really easy. It's a really pretty stitch. Look at that. It's so pretty for blankets, and it's quick. It's quick, and that's what everyone wants, a really quick blanket. Firstly, I want to say thank you to everyone who's been going onto my coffee page. I'll put a link underneath the video, and helping out the channel by donating the price of a cup of coffee. It's just like if you meet me in the street and you say, would you like a cup of coffee? Well, you can do that on that coffee page and just click on the link underneath the video. So I'm going to show you how to do this beautiful stitch. So the stitch count for this pattern is 2, and then you'll add 1 extra stitch at the end. So I'm going to do a chain, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. So you'll do your chain as long as you want it to be. I'm doing this little sample. I'm going to chain an extra 3 stitches. 1, 2, 3. Now that's going to count as my first UK treble crochet. So into the 4th stitch, count 1, 2, 3, and into the 4th stitch you're going to do a treble crochet. So yarn over and into that 4th stitch in the chain, 1 treble crochet, and we're going to do another one into that same stitch. So that's you done your first V stitch. You're going to skip a stitch and then put 2 treble crochets into the next stitch, and if you're in the USA, that's 2 double crochets for you. So skip 1 and make a V stitch. That's 2 into the same stitch. You're going to skip a stitch and then do a V stitch. You're going to do that all the way along. So when you've done your last V stitch, you should have 1 stitch left. If you've got 2 stitches left, then just pick 1 out, but you should just have 1 left, and you're going to do a treble crochet into that last stitch. So yarn over and into that last stitch, and you've got your row of V stitches. So you're going to chain 1 and turn your work right into that very first stitch, right where you've done that chain 1. This very first stitch, you're going to do a double crochet right into there and pull through your 2 loops. You're going to chain 1, you're going to skip 2 stitches, and in between the V stitches you end up in between the V's. We're going to work in between the V stitch in the space. You're going to put a double crochet. So just straight in and pull through your 2 loops. Chain 1 and move to the next space. So you'll be skipping 2 stitches. We're going to be working into the spaces in between the V's in here. Double crochet, chain 1, skip 2, and then double crochet into the space. Chain 1, skip 2 stitches and into the space all the way along. Chain 1 and you're working in the spaces. So when you're at the end, you're going to double crochet into the top of that chain there. You've got 1, 2 and a third stitch there. So you're skipping these two and it should be the top of that chain. You're going to do a double crochet. So count 1, 2 and 3 stitches. So do your chain 1 and then into the top of that chain. Going to chain 1, turn your work, and you're going to go right into that very first stitch. So for this row you're going to go into that very first stitch and do your double crochet. Pull through, yarn over through 2 loops. Now you're going to do a double crochet into the chain 1 space. So in there. Now chain 1. And you're going to work 1 double crochet into each of the chain spaces. So you'll chain 1 and do 1 double crochet into the chain space, chain 1 and do 1 double crochet into the chain space all the way along. So I've done my chain 1 and I'm going in to the chain space, chain 1, skip that stitch and go into the next chain space, chain 1, skip the stitch and into the chain space all the way along. And this is how you work the mesh that's in between your V stitches. Chain 1, skip the stitch and work into the chain space. So at the end you're going to chain 1, you're going to work into the chain space and you're going to work into the top of that little chain that's there. So I've done my chain 1, work into that chain space and then in to that little double crochet there. Chain 1, turn your work, you're going to go straight in to that first one, that first stitch there. You're going to chain 1, skip that little stitch there and go into that chain space. So you're going into the chain spaces again. So into the chain space, chain 1, skip the stitch and go into the chain space, chain 1, skip the stitch and go into the chain space, chain 1, skip the stitch all the way along. So at the end you're going into the chain space, chain 1 and you're going in to the end of that double crochet. Now the 3 Now the 3 rows that we do in between the V stitch, so it staggers like a mesh. You can do as many of these rows as you want, but your first one is a double crochet. The first one is you're going to double crochet into there, chain 1 and go in between the V stitches. The second row is you'll double crochet into the top of that one, double crochet into the chain space and then start your chain 1 and then go into the chain space, chain 1, skip the stitch and go into the chain space. And then your next row you're doing one double crochet, chain 1 and then go into the chain space. So when you're doing your 3 rows, you're staggering them above each other. and it staggers it and it makes that little mesh pattern. Just rewind the video and you'll get the hang of this. It's really easy. It's quite a stretchy stitch as well. So I've done my 3 rows of the double crochet. I'm going to chain 3. 1, 2, 3. That makes my first treble crochet. I'm going to turn my work, and then into the chain spaces I'm going to put a V stitch. So yarn over, and I'm going to do that V stitch again. So that's 1. So we're doing treble crochets 2 into the same stitch. So that's 1. And that's 2. So we're going to move over to the next chain space and do a V stitch. That's 1 and 2 into the same space, and you're going to do that all the way along. So into the chain space. We're using the chain spaces in this pattern all the time. And you'll put a V stitch into every chain space that's in between the stitches. So I'm on my last chain space and I'll put my V stitch in there. So 1 and 2, and you're going to treble crochet into the top of this double crochet. Chain 1, and we're going to do the 3 rows of mesh again. So chain 1 and turn. You're going to put a double crochet into this very first stitch. Then you'll chain 1 and go over into the spaces in between the V stitches. So into that stitch, that very first stitch, chain 1, skip your 2 stitches and go in between. You're going in between the V in here. Chain 1 and move to the next one all the way along. It's really quick, really simple. Make sure you do your chain 1. Chain 1, chain 1, so I'm going into the last space my V is, chain 1, and I'm going into the top of that chain of 3. Chain 1 and turn. So you're going to double crochet into that stitch there, that very first stitch, and then you'll double crochet into the first chain. Then you'll chain 1 and go into the next chain space, so that we stagger these chains. If you don't, you'll have a chain above a chain and it'll look like a ladder. So double crochet into the first stitch, and then you're going to double crochet into the next chain, this chain space. You'll chain 1, double crochet into the chain space, chain 1 and double crochet into the chain space all the way along, and at the end you'll have 2 double crochets. You'll double crochet into the chain space and then double crochet into the top of that last double crochet. That's the middle stitch of these 3 rows of your double crochets. If you keep rewinding the video, you'll soon get the hang of this. It is quite easy. So I've done my chain 1 and I'm going into this very first stitch here. I'm going to do a double crochet into the chain space. Then I'm going to start my chain 1 and work into the chain spaces. So chain 1, skip that stitch and work into the chain space. Chain 1, skip the stitch and work into the chain space, and that's going to make your mesh. Chain 1, I've done that, skip that stitch and go in to the chain space all the way along. So I've done my chain 1 and I'm at my last chain space. I'm going to double crochet into the chain space and double crochet into the last stitch. So go in to the chain space and then do another one into that last stitch. So when you do your 3 rows of the mesh, you'll start with 1 double crochet, your next row will have 2 double crochets together, and your last row will have 1 double crochet, and then you'll do your V-stitch again. So just rewind the video if you get stuck doing that mesh, staggering that mesh. And this is what it looks like when it's nice and stretchy. It's great for little bags and things, for beach bags. And it makes a really pretty, look at that, makes a really pretty blanket. So that's my second row of the mesh. So we're going to chain 1 and turn. This is the 3rd row, and then we'll go back to that V-stitch. Right into the very first stitch, you're going to do a double crochet. Now you're going to chain 1 and you're going to skip that stitch and go into the chain space. So skip the stitch and into the chain space. Chain 1, skip the stitch and work into the chain space. Chain 1, skip the stitch and go into the chain space all the way along. So we're at the end and I'm going to work into that last chain space. Chain 1, skip that stitch and do a double crochet into that last stitch, and that will keep your pattern and stagger your mesh rows. Now we're going to do the V-stitch row again. So chain 3, 1, 2, 3, turn your work. So in to that chain space, you're going to put your V-stitch. You're going to put a V-stitch into each chain space. So skip the stitch there and into there, into the chain space. You're going to build your V-stitch. We're going to do that all the way along. 2 stitches into the 1 space. Skip the stitch and you're at the chain space. Put your V-stitch in. Skip the stitch and into the chain space. All the way along. So at the end I've got 1 chain space left. Put my V-stitch in. So most of this pattern you're going, other than the very last stitches, you'll be working in chain spaces and the spaces between your V-stitches. So into this very last double crochet we're going to put a treble crochet. You chain 1 and turn, and then you'll repeat the 3 mesh rows again. Just rewind the video and repeat the 3 mesh rows and your V-stitch row, your 3 mesh rows and your V-stitch row. You can use any yarn for it. Use the hook size it tells you on your yarn label. Give it a try and don't give up with it, because it is quite simple once you've got used to it, and it's so pretty. So give this stitch a try. It's a really pretty stitch. So thank you to everyone who's been going onto my coffee page and helping the channel out by buying me a cup of coffee. And you can subscribe to the channel for free. It's completely free to subscribe to any YouTube channel. If you click on the subscribe button and just follow the simple steps, and then if you click on the bell icon, YouTube will tell you when I put up another tutorial. So until the next time, happy crafting, and I'll see you all again soon. Goodbye.